Let me just say, we could have ended with the choir. They made pretty much every point I could possibly hope to make, and they did it melodiously and with great beauty and energy. So thank you to the choir, and I suppose I should apologize for what that sounds like in prose. How do you identify? In different contexts, we will each answer this basic question differently, depending on who is asking the question, what the available categories are, and what the alternatives may be in responding. When it comes to religion, the question of our identity often takes the form, what do you believe? And that question often lands us in serious trouble, as I explained just a few weeks ago, especially when it's asked by someone who has mastered the doctrines of their own religion, arrived at firm and unwavering conclusions, sometimes unquestioned, and stands ready to point out how our beliefs may be wanting, if not fundamentally wrong. What do you believe? Is the question asked by creedal religions, and our very salvation is held to rest upon getting the answer right. That is, right according to the doctrines of the interrogating religion and its adherents. In his book, Sacred Fragments, Rabbi Neil Gilman notes that the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, Mordecai Kaplan, taught that there are three possible ways of identifying with a religious community: by behaving, by believing, or by belonging. Kaplan himself insisted that the primary form of Jewish identification is belonging, that intuitive sense of kinship that binds every Jew to every other Jew in history and in the contemporary world. Whatever Jews may believe, and however they believe as Jews, serves to shape and concretize that underlying sense of being bound to a people with a shared history and identity. In practice, I can't think of any religious tradition that emphasizes one of these three ways of identification to the exclusion of the other two. It seems to me that all three ways come into play whenever any of us identify ourselves with a particular religious path or spiritual community. In our case, there are things that are commonly believed by most Unitarian Universalists, or perhaps more likely, there are things that are commonly disbelieved by Unitarian Universalists. There are behaviors and practices, even a sense of ethics that are shared by most of us. We have remarkably common values as a community. And of course, there are communities, we call them congregations, although there are also subgroups within them and denominational organizations that grow out of them, that give us a sense of belonging to one another. We are spiritual kin. For the most part, adopted spiritual kin, but kin nonetheless. There is a web of behaving, believing, and belonging that gives us a sense of identity as Unitarian Universalists, both collectively and individually. On balance, though, it may be said that belonging has been our primary means of identifying as Unitarian Universalists. We're not far from what Mordecai Kaplan suggested. We claim this identity for ourselves by belonging to spiritual communities making up the Unitarian Universalist tradition. here in North America and around the world. Owing to our name, most people assume that Unitarianism owes its birth to the denial of the doctrine of the Trinity as unscriptural, and that the basis of our fellowship must be grounded in belief, like most other religious traditions. But a strong argument can be made, especially here in North America, that the defining doctrine of those who came to be called Unitarians involved their higher estimate of human nature. Over and against the Calvinist doctrine of total depravity, the liberal Congregationalists of New England argued that human beings, while capable of sin, some of us are richly capable, that human beings were born with a capacity for goodness, even righteousness, if we dare use that word. Instead of total depravity, they advanced a doctrine of human dignity. The living legacy of this departure from Calvinist thinking is found in our first principle, which affirms the worth and dignity of every person. Whatever else it may be, that principle is a declaration that we are not Calvinists, that we have a different estimate of human beings and their capacity for goodness, however often we may fall short. Conrad Wright, a Unitarian Universalist layperson who was professor of American church history at Harvard Divinity School, suggested that there was an additional ingredient fueling the Unitarian controversy in the 19th century. It wasn't just about doctrine. And this ingredient was found in the liberals' answer to the question posed by the biblical prophet Amos. I know that Amos has been likely weighing on your mind all week. And you often wake up and think to yourself, what would Amos think about that? Amos's question was simple. Can two walk together except they be agreed? Think about that question for a moment. Can two walk together except they be agreed? The Orthodox answer, which emphasized the primacy of belief and behavior, which is to say doctrine and discipline, was a firm no. It is not possible to walk together. That is, to follow a religious path together without being agreed on belief and the behaviors that follow from it. Sometimes every jot and tittle of the manual of discipline must be followed to belong. By contrast, the liberals answered Amos's question with an unequivocal yes. It is possible to walk together in spiritual fellowship irrespective of differences of belief and with a breadth of allowable behavior. As Francis David, whose portrait hangs in the library, is reported to have said, albeit erroneously, we need not think alike to love alike. We need not behave alike to love alike either. Thus, very early in our history as a separate religious body, Conrad Wright observed, we insisted that creedal statements are not the proper basis for religious fellowship. More than that theological diversity is not only to be tolerated, but to be embraced as a good thing. We assert the right and duty of each one of us to adhere to their understanding of religious truth, and we accept the obligation to respect one another, even if we do not always agree. We believe deeply in the capacity of people of goodwill to walk together in religious fellowship despite such doctrinal differences. Church membership, of course, is sometimes a family affair, but like families themselves, how it gets passed on is complicated. You know, we don't bequeath our church to our children in our wills, nor do we hand it off to them necessarily as a gift. Ultimately, it's an individual decision. And in the case of our tradition, one generation can influence the next, but it cannot compel it. We join the liberal church as individuals, a personal decision of our own free will, and we may leave it as individuals without formal repercussions. We don't shun former members, nor treat them differently than any other neighbor or friend once they've departed. There is no such thing as an apostate Unitarian Universalist. In fact, it's not even necessary to be a member in order to be involved in the life of our congregations. Although there are certain offices and rights that are necessarily limited to members, those are the things you see on college diplomas as all the rights and privileges thereto appertaining. It turns out that there aren't a lot of them, but they may be significant, such as voting or serving on the board. On my pilgrimages to Transylvania, I have met individuals whose families have identified as Unitarians since 1568, more than 4.5 centuries ago. But even then, the decision to become members has to be made anew with each passing generation. It's a legacy, but not a direct inheritance. In some cases, that may be 20 generations in Transylvania, perhaps more. In their case, there's a deep sense of belonging as the primary basis of religious affiliation. I've stayed several times in a village of some 400 souls where nearly everyone in the village identifies as a Unitarian. If your family can trace its connection to Unitarianism back to your 16th or 18th great-grandparents, it's likely that your adherence to Unitarianism will be mixed with the intuitive sense of kinship that Mordecai Kaplan had in mind when he insisted that the primary form of Jewish identification is belonging. There is no place where you are more likely to experience the sense of Unitarians belonging to one another than you will find in the Transylvanian Alps. In my own family, we can trace our first contact with Unitarianism back to my great-great-grandparents, who followed Magnus Skaptason out of the Lutheran Synod. There were no ravens involved. Following his Easter sermon in 1891, although they later returned to Lutheranism. However, my family can scarcely be called a Unitarian family in the same way our spiritual kin in Transylvania might describe theirs. Instead, mine is a family for which Unitarianism, and later Unitarian Universalism, was a choice, if only because we were aware in each passing generation that it existed, that it was available to us. So my great-grandparents were members of the Labor Church in Weston, which was part of a short-lived liberal religious movement with a functionally Unitarian doctrine and practice that was established in this city the year before the Winnipeg General Strike. It's no surprise that one of their sons later joined All Souls Church, while another became a Unitarian on the West Coast. My great-grandmother's sister and her family became stalwarts in the Unitarian Church in Blaine, Washington. For the most part, though, that generation ushered in an attitude of religious indifference. My father, who attended the Banning Street Church as a teenager, identified as a Unitarian, but he never signed the membership book. However, it was this spiritual pedigree, this sense of somehow belonging, if only around the margins, that led me here following my father's death when I was 18. My mother used to joke, "You'll never find a Unitarian or a Universalist in my family." Ha, 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 Mom. Turns out my great-great-grandfather on her side of the family was part of an evangelical, a German evangelical family, a congregation in southern Ontario that was expelled from the Evangelical Association for the heresy of universalism. It turns out I get it on both sides of my family. And even my mother finally caved and became a Unitarian. After attending for a while, I was never interested in the youth group, something I probably shouldn't admit. After attending for a while, I made the decision to join this congregation when I was 21. In this, I was joined by one of my brothers and my sister. Over time, my involvement deepened, along with my sense of belonging not only to this congregation, but to the whole Unitarian Universalist tradition itself. And then my involvement in our faith led me elsewhere. There was work to do. I've been a member of 5 different congregations over the years where I was involved in different ways. And there's a congregation in Minnesota where I have never been a member, but where I have a deep sense of belonging. For a long time, I felt a deeper connection to the denomination than any single congregation, although that feeling was waning even before I retired from the UUA staff. Through it all, I have a strong sense of connection to that great cloud of witnesses across generations and even across denominations who have promoted the liberal spirit in religion from the Reformation to the present day. It's possible to feel a sense of belonging to a congregation without having any sense of belonging to the tradition of which it's a part, although that generally diminishes with each passing year. The tradition grows on you. It's also possible to feel a connection, a sense of belonging to a community without holding formal membership in it. And it's even possible to be a member without feeling that you belong at all. There may be a strong correlation between membership and a sense of belonging, but it isn't absolute. I've known church members who were only peripherally involved in their spiritual communities, and friends of congregations who were right in the thick of things. It's been nearly a decade since I served on the professional staff of the Unitarian Universalist Association, so I'm not privy to the latest statistics on church membership. And since the denominational directory, as we once knew it, is a thing of the past, I'm not even certain that we keep the kind of statistics we once did. We were never particularly good at it. It does seem to me that we measure less than before, and I'm skeptical about the statistics we do keep, although there have always been problems with the veracity of our numbers. In any event, during most of my time at the UUA, our statistics clearly revealed that fewer than 1 in 6 adult Unitarian Universalists had been raised as Unitarian Universalists. That makes us very different than Transylvania. It's also a pretty dismal number when you think about it. And we had various hypotheses to explain and sometimes explain away why we didn't have stronger membership retention across the generations. But that's the topic for another sermon. Suffice it for now to say that Unitarian Universalist membership does not pass from one generation to the next in large numbers, although it's entirely possible that Unitarian Universalist identity, or at least a liberal religious outlook, does. For whatever reason, the sense of belonging seems to diminish from one generation to the next. Unitarian Universalism depends on newcomers finding a sense of belonging in our congregations more than just about any religious community except the Shakers. And they were celibate. Like any organizing principle, gathering a congregation on the basis of belonging with belief as a secondary consideration works better in theory than in practice. It's hard to live up to high principles without ever faltering, concedes Conrad Wright. And we must admit that some of the most dramatic moments in our history have occurred when our tolerance of diversity wore very thin, and we were challenged to live up to the principles we proclaimed. To make matters even more difficult, by their very nature, the highest principles are open to diverse interpretations. We may see this most clearly in the political realm, where words like freedom, fairness, and justice scarcely mean the same thing when they appear in the platforms of different parties. But even within parties, or within religious communities, there can be considerable variation in what principles mean and what they call us to do. In Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, physiological needs are foundational: food, shelter, rest, followed by a sense of safety, whether personal, emotional, or economic. Then follows the need for love and social belonging. I'm inclined to think that Maslow underestimated the importance of love and belonging. In fact, I'm quite certain he did, not to mention the need for meaning. In fact, I don't know how we can have a sense of safety without a sense of belonging. So it seems to me that there is a certain genius in putting belonging ahead of believing, community before creed. But doing so sometimes calls upon us to set our differences aside, or at least tolerate differing points of view while seeking a consensus about how we can live together in community, recognizing that we need not think alike to love alike. We need not always be on the same page. We need not think the exact same things to be comrades. It is more important to be together than it is to be always right. Right relationship takes precedence over right belief. This isn't always easy. Indeed, it usually isn't. But it follows naturally from our decision to put belonging first and foremost as our organizing principle. What I've found in this church and in the other Unitarian Universalist congregations where I have belonged is a sense of companionship that I've found almost nowhere else. I have sometimes found myself disenchanted by the Unitarian Universalist movement as a whole, and I've sometimes felt disappointed in the congregations where I've been involved. but I have never felt the occasion to feel like I didn't belong, even when I found myself in the minority, which is more frequent than you might imagine. Even looking out today, I always sit on that side of the church where there's fewer people, whereas you're kind of clustered over here. Having grown up in an imperfect family, filled with people I love, I have no reason to apply a different standard in a spiritual community filled with people I belong to and who belong to me. As humans, we have a deep-seated need to belong to someone, somewhere, something, at least sometimes. We seek out communities, both formal and informal ones, and when they matter to us, we may desire a deeper quality of relationship. We strive to be members and not just consumers of community and the social relationships that communities offer. In doing so, our lives are enriched, and the world becomes a better, brighter place. Our recording will be stopping now as we prepare to sing our final hymn, number 1064, Blue Boat Home.